Hello, and welcome to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I'm the Reverend Dr. Asa Lee, and I serve as the president of Pittsburgh Seminary. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, students, board, and all of the community, I welcome you to our Kelso lecture this year. I'm particularly excited to welcome my fraternity brother and colleague in this work, the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, president of the Children's Defense Fund. I'm excited that he is a part of our two-day series, and you'll have an opportunity to engage him. My regret is that I cannot be present. I am on the West Coast meeting with alums, meeting with donors and others, but I know you'll have a fabulous experience, an intense experience, and so please feel free to engage in all of the learning, but also engage in the hospitality of the Pittsburgh Seminary community. And we look forward to connecting with you in the days, weeks, and months to come. Thank you for your participation and the opportunity to learn together and grow together as we seek to be doers of the word as well as neighbors to one another. God bless you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Helen Blyer, and with my colleagues here at the seminary, I'd like to amplify Dr. Lee's welcome that was just extended to all of you, both here in the Hicks Chapel Sanctuary and those of you who are joining us online. We're delighted to be hosting the 2023 Kelso Lecture and Community Conversation on Race and Faith, an event that has a remarkable origin story, one that you will be hearing in just a moment. We're kicking things off tonight with this lecture. It's my task to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are joining online, please know that you are going to be able to participate in the conversation through chat and through Q&A. As our speaker is talking tonight, I'll be engaging those of you online through the chat pod. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and you all can start things off by dropping your name in the chat right now and where you are joining us from. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. We have a mic set up here in the front of the sanctuary for our in-person guests. And those of you who are online should use the Q&A pod, not the chat pod, the Q&A pod. I'll be monitoring it, and I will relay your questions to our guest during the appointed time. After the lecture, we're going to have a reception down one flight in the auditorium lobby. I wish we had the technology to have our online guests share in what looks like is going to be a pretty nice spread. And finally, the recording will be available in about 2 weeks on our YouTube channel, along with all of our other recorded lectures. And now I will turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Reverend Dave Swanson, who serves as the pastor of Pittsburgh Mennonite Church and as the chair of the Pennsylvania Interfaith Impact Network Spiritual Leaders Caucus. Dave.
Good evening, everyone. It is good to be here. My name is Dave Swanson. I pastor Pittsburgh Mennonite Church, just a few miles from here. And I wanted to tell you a bit of the story of the genesis of this event. It was really born out of a theological conviction that the Church of Jesus Christ has within the scope of its purpose the cultivation of a kind of relational connection that destroys segregation. In the intervening years, I've come to think of segregation as having sort of three important aspects. The segregation of belonging, you and your folk there, and me and my folk here. The segregation of experience and emotion. What happens to you and your folk, and how it registers in you, really has no bearing on what happens to me and how it registers in me and my people. And the segregation of destiny. Who and what you become has no bearing on who and what I become and my folk over here. And so 8 years ago, I came to Pittsburgh in May of 2014 to pastor my first pastorate, fresh out of Duke Divinity School. And within a short period of time, Eric Garner was killed in New York City. And then a couple months later, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And a few months after that, Tamir Rice and others through the fall. And a conversation began in our local ministerium, which is the Pittsburgh word for the pastors group. And I got to know Reverend Robert Tedder, who was pastor at Union Baptist Church, just a few blocks away from my congregation. My congregation, mostly a white middle-class group. Union Baptist, a black congregation that had been in Swissvale for generations. And we started to get together and talk about our lives and the lives of our congregations, and to trace this line of segregation that's dropped between neighborhoods, between classes, between races, and follow it right down the center of the lives of our churches and our traditions. And we came to this conviction that to the extent that we will be faithful, we have to break down the wall of separation. You know, you can hear the echoes of Ephesians 2. Christ has broken down the dividing wall, and we started to think about what it means to cultivate a kind of belonging that transgresses all of these divides that keep us separated, that separates our sense of belonging to one another in relationship, that separates our sense of our destinies, that separates our sense of what happens to each other and in different communities being disconnected, you know, the idea of disconnection. And so we came to the understanding that it's up to us. If not us, who? If not now, when? And so what began as a community service and relationship of lament, where we had a worship service together at our two communities of lament and hope and commitment. And at that point, we started to develop a relationship with the seminary here. And I've spent a lot of time in seminaries. And I don't know about you, but I think it's fairly uncommon for seminaries to see something happening independently of them in the community and bring it in and bless it and cultivate it. And that is what has happened. And to the real credit to this institution, that something that happened just at the grassroots in our neighborhood was brought into an annual conversation. And I think a commitment, a vital commitment from this institution, recognizing the fact that it has been, as most seminary institutions have been, disconnected from the streets, from the pews, from the pulpits, and the real problems that real people and real communities are dealing with. And so I'm so grateful to be here and to tell this story with each of you, to all of you, because it is powerful and it is setting a kind of trajectory that I think is vital for the livelihood, for the ongoing vitality of the church. That there has to be a true conversation, learning that travels in multiple directions, that the theological prerogatives of the academy have to be willing to learn from the realities of life in the world in ways that it hasn't always. And so I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so privileged to be part of this, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Wilson, who's going to share with us. And I really look forward to the legacy of this event continuing into the future. And I welcome you all.
Yeah, y'all can clap. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Take a deep breath in, let one out. We are here to learn, to engage, to be in conversation with each other, even as a part of this Kelso lecture. So it gives me great honor. I'm Anne Marie Mingo. I am Associate Professor of Ethics, Culture, and Moral Leadership, as well as the Acting Director of the Metro Urban Institute here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And I'm happy to be co-sponsoring and leading this along with Dr. Blyer. Preacher, prophet, philanthropist, activist, agitator, advocate, father, faith leader, freedom lover, theologian, tester of boundaries, teacher, justice seeker, Jesus follower, and just good folks. It is my privilege this evening to introduce the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson to the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary community and our friends. Those attributes are just a few of the ways that I might describe my friend and brother in struggle. You've got a little bit of information that's already there in your programs, but I'll just also note that this brother who has come to speak to us tonight as a Kelso lecturer was hand-tapped by the esteemed founder and groundbreaking activist Marian Wright Edelman as the first person to follow her leadership as she founded the Children's Defense Fund. He now serves as the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund and the CDF Action Council. With a commitment to leave no child behind, the CDF envisions a nation where marginalized children flourish, where leaders prioritize the well-being of these young people, and communities just like ours get a chance to wield the power to ensure that young people will thrive. Dr. Wilson's leadership is also greatly leveraged, not only as the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, but also as the board chair for the National Committee of Responsive Philanthropy and the Forum for Theological Exploration. He also serves on the boards of Duke Divinity School, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. From 2011 to 2020, Reverend Wilson was the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, which is a faith-based philanthropy for child well-being and racial justice in St. Louis, Missouri. From 2008 to 2018, Dr. Wilson pastored the St. John's Church, which was known and is still known as the Beloved Community. It is a multiracial congregation in the city of St. Louis that is continuing to do great activist work right where they are and with arms that reach beyond. It was under his leadership that the foundation constructed and established the Deaconess Center for Child Well-Being, which is a community action tank engaging thousands of citizens annually. It was after the police killing of Michael Brown, which was just mentioned as one of the spark points for so many of us. This church, the church that he pastored, St. John's, the Beloved Community, hosted the hashtag Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride to Ferguson, where people from all over the nation did a freedom ride by bus to Ferguson, Missouri, as well as other mobilizations. It was in Ferguson that I encountered Reverend Wilson for the first time, having traveled with a group of scholars and activists for the one-year anniversary of Michael Brown's killing. In connection to his work and commitments, Reverend Wilson was appointed co-chair of the Ferguson Commission within the state of Missouri, and that commission released the Forward Through Ferguson, a Path Towards Racial Equity report that called for sweeping changes in policing, in courts, child well-being, and economic mobility. Dr. Wilson is a learned man. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from Xavier University of Louisiana, his master's of divinity degree from Eaton Theological Seminary in Missouri, and a doctor of ministry from Duke University. He's a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, for anybody that may be in here, as well as Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity, and he is married to the lovely and talented, brilliant and beautiful, also my sorority sister, Dr. LaToya Smith Wilson, who is a dentist and child advocate, and they together parent 4 brilliant and beautiful children. Preacher, prophet, philanthropist, activist, agitator, advocate, father, faith leader, freedom lover, theologian, tester of boundaries, and teacher, justice seeker, Jesus follower, and just good folks. It is my privilege to introduce to you my friend and brother, the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. Hear ye him.
Giving all praise to God, to my dear sister, Dr. Mingo, Dr. Blyer, my fraternity brother in his absence, President Lee, Pastor Swanson, fellow Blue Devil. We celebrated together last night's win, holding off Oral Roberts. I think that was a theological battle for the our dear brother and leader in work and struggle, Dr. John Welch. Glad to be here and glad to be with all of you. Later this month, my pastor and father in ministry, the Reverend Earl Edward Nance Jr., the pastor of Greater Mount Carmel Missionary Baptist Church in St. Louis, Missouri, who ordained me in the year 2002 and gave me the opportunity to engage in the most consequential ministry, most consequential service in life that I have provided to date outside of being a husband and a father. He allowed me to serve as youth pastor to a generation of children and young people in St. Louis through serving beside him at Greater Mount Carmel, beginning in 2002. He'll turn 70 later this month. And he taught me something in the apprenticeship model of Black church leadership and training that comes from many of us before seminary and sometimes runs concurrent with seminary and often conflicts what we learn in seminary. He taught me this thing about going into places. Don't believe the introduction. He said there's always somebody who's willing to talk about the great man of God who can walk on water and turn water into wine. Don't believe the introduction. Especially don't believe your own. But in this case, I'm just saying, why not try it? I thank Dr. Mingo for that kind introduction and reminder of my pastor's words. I do want to treat thoughtfully the theme of our gathering today and tomorrow, to whom are we neighbor? With the prism and background of this lecture, which in many ways I track with in my life of public ministry, because its origins come at a time of my own transformation and radicalization at the hands of the aforementioned young people, many of whom in the streets of Ferguson and streets across the United States of America invited the church to rethink its theology if it would take them seriously. And so I want to treat this seriously, and I don't want to miss. I want to name up front what I'm doing, so you can remember it if it feels like I'm not doing it in a particular moment. You can say, I'll stay with him because I think he's going somewhere. I want to treat this commitment to understanding and anti-racism that is a part of the critical crux of the Kelso lecture and the convening in the conference where we wrestle with these matters in community through the lens of what children and young people today have to say. I take the voices and the experiences of children and young people as a source of authority for my ministry. Now, I do not take these voices to the diminishment of Scripture. In fact, part of the project that I find myself called to in this moment in service to the 74 million children who now make up my youth group because of my responsibilities at the Children's Defense Fund. I take their voices as authority, and I seek to unearth the authorities that we have lost in other sources of authority in the life of the church, including in Scripture. I am discerning in community where are the places that we have lost the hearing of the voice of God because we have failed to hear our children. And in this moment of American history, these voices invite us to the anti-racist intersection that Pastor Swanson has invited us to, because they are, for the first time in America's history, predominantly black and brown. And if we do not hear them, then we do not take seriously the calls to racial justice. And if we say we want to have racial justice, then we must take seriously, if we desire for it to be sustainable, the voices of children. Make sense? That's what I'm up to. One of the places I find us as church folk, I mean church folk here. I know we're in a seminary, but I don't want to presume anything. One of the places where I have been arrested in the Judeo-Christian tradition is in a passage of Scripture in the 11th chapter of Isaiah that talks about a future that is desirable and leadership that is expected, and does so by centering on the picture of a little child. I lift it for your hearing. Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 9 read this way. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge for the poor, and decide with equity for the oppressed of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. So read verses 1 through 5. Then verse 6. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the lion will feed together. One version of Scripture says will fatten together. And a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze together. The young shall lie down, their young shall lie down together. And the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So ends the reading. This scripture, these scriptures, this passage, these two passages have been read over time and in our hearing to mean two different things. They have been read over time in our hearing to be about two different things. We have segmented them based upon what our good Bibles have given us. Segmented based upon verses that the process of canonization have inserted. Segmented based upon chapters that the process of canonization and privileged men have decided would be the breaks and the marks. And then segmented by those who would write commentaries who say that verses 1 through 5 are about one thing and verses 6 through 9 about another. Segmented all by grown-ups. We have wrestled with much of this segmentation. We recognize that many of these separations are arbitrary. We have honored that these verses and marks are sometimes in the wrong places, especially when we take the Bible both seriously and treat it critically. But there's this thing about privilege that still shows up in our interpretation of text over time, including the reading by privileged, educated, largely men, about what this Pauline figure or the second century bishop with an axe to grind, Dr. Deb Krause would say, has written about women keeping silent in the assembly. A privilege that shows up when people who have not historically been enslaved preach and proclaim slaves, obey your masters. A privilege that shows up when grown people read a text about leadership and about the promised future of a community. And the picture of leadership is of a child and say, oh, that can't be. It must be. It's got to be. Oh, that first part, it must be about Jesus later. And that last part is so comic and so cosmic. I mean, a leopard, a lion, and a lamb. The bear is hanging out with his steak dinner. Do we really believe that these figures will get along in what the commentary writers, what the segmenters of the text of the sacred have called this, the peaceable kingdom? The peaceable kingdom, the promised future, where all of these idyllic circumstances, the more educated we become, the less we believe in the idyllic being manifest. But we are here. We are here in America in 2023 talking about the vision of neighborliness. We're not talking about the peaceful kingdom. We half people here were willing to identify as church folk. Wrestling with the concept that beyond the world's vices and divisions, people can come together under the gaze of eternity and stand equal at the foot of the cross. We're here at a conference gathering talking about an anti-racist reality in a state where 1 of every 5 black children live in poverty. I'm sorry, got that wrong. 1 of every 5 children live in poverty. We're wrestling with the idyllic. I'm not sure how comfortable I can be. Let's see. I fly out at what time in the morning? Okay. The lion and the lamb could be a donkey and an elephant.
Oh my, come on now.
Say it.
The lion, the calf and the lion could be a fox and MSNBC. The bear and the cow could be the left and the right. We are here trading in the potential of the idyllic. A gathered community that overwhelms the aforementioned three segregations. Perhaps King would call it the beloved community, borrowing from Josiah Royce. Johnny Bernard Hill would read it, as he interprets King's public theology, as a multi-ethnic, multi-racial community of peace and justice with love as the governing ethic. To be neighbor in an anti-racist way and to overwhelm, to overcome these segregations, to live in the context of racial justice and racial equity as peaceable community is as cosmic, as comic, and as cartoon-like in America today as the picture of a child playing over the hole of an ass, a weaned child, a toddler, putting their hand in the adder's den. It is a dangerous proposition that is idyllic at best, and yet you register for a conversation about it. We are working toward, our desire is to build toward the beloved community. Our hope is something as idyllic as this text. And there are those who would say that it is just as foolhardy if you pay close attention to the public debate and the political dialogue in our country today. If you take seriously the design of our communities and the work of public rhetoric to separate us, then we are working toward a vision that is just as aspirational as the one that we find in the text. What I invite us to wrestle with is that our hope for that kind of future is not separated. Our hope for the vision of verses 6 through 9 is not separated from the kind of leadership that is described in verses 1 through 5. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his eyes hear, but with righteousness he shall judge for the poor and decide with equity for the oppressed of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and the breath of his lips he shall kill. The wicked righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. And I choose to believe, because I've got this ethical commitment, that God doesn't talk past people. I choose to believe that God is not so high that God would say something that God would not mean to mean something for the people who God is speaking to. God don't talk past me. And so I refuse to believe that this text would talk past the people wrestling with the realities of the community of Isaiah where it is first declared. I refuse to believe in the project of Christian supersessionism that this is about me and not about the people gathered around. And so it cannot be about Jesus for me if it's not about promised leadership and justice for the people who heard it. And so, no matter how I heard this text preached and proclaimed, separate from the peaceable kingdom later, no matter how I heard it to be so Christocentric that people would stand up and every answer to every sermon was Jesus, I can't treat it like that, because that meant it didn't mean anything to the people there, which meant God overlooked their pains and their sorrows. And so, part of the project is to say, maybe the separation of the picture of the promised community of the future is tied up in a leadership that is spoken of just before the community. And maybe if we don't separate verses 1 through 5 from verses 6 through 9, that leadership may look like the child that is in the latter part of the passage. The child who sees things differently and doesn't decide by what his eyes see or what her ears hear. The child who grows up with equity in mind in a way that we didn't. A group of children whose demographic reality finally reflect the articulated hope of the American dream, a multiracial democracy, but didn't have the demographic staging ground, and now finally, post-2020, we do. What would it mean to take seriously that our hopes for beloved community, that our hopes for overcoming the challenges of segregation, our hopes for looking beyond the racial realities that have kept us separated, that our hopes are actually in the children? It would mean that we get to be like Jesus. Jesus, who when all the church people were gathered around and desperate parents were trying to get their children to him, told the desperate disciples, get out of their way. I'm sorry, said it differently. Suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. For of such is the kingdom of heaven. Then goes further. If you do not enter in, then you can't come. We are well positioned alongside Jesus, as uncomfortable as it may seem and feel, to have our hopes for a new neighborhood, our hopes for beloved community, our hopes for peaceable kingdom, our hopes for ecclesia, our hope for promised land, our hope for new America, or our hope for a more perfect union, to be tied up in a community of 74 million children. 74 million. I know it makes you uncomfortable to say, I don't know them 74 million people. It was 74 million once the final counts happened after all of the recounts, because, you know, we didn't make sure the thing wasn't stolen. Just over 74 million people were elected the last president, elected the current president. And there were 74 million more who will be impacted by the public policy of this administration who didn't get a vote. 74 million more who are whole souls, even though they don't yet have the franchise, who don't have lobbyists. 74 million more who represent the hope of demographic diversity, more than we do, who only get a voice if we're willing to take seriously that they may be the leader that is spoken of in this text. What does it mean? What might it mean to take seriously that children and young people are sources of authority for leadership for a future that is more equitable, that is more racially just? What would it mean to say that the hope for a new neighborhood are totally and completely tied up in centering children in the discussion? What would it mean to do as the city of Kansas City did more than 20 years ago, to require that a children's assessment be done of every piece of legislation? Inasmuch as the state legislatures require a fiscal note, the critical question there was, is it good for the children before any piece of legislation is passed? And what would it mean to design and to develop new neighborhoods like those that we have experienced in the last few years in this community in East Liberty by asking first, what are the needs? What are the wants? What are the hopes? Or in the case of the scripture here, what are the dangers that are circling around these children? In public schools in the state of Pittsburgh, where 84% of black children don't read at grade level, more than 54% of White children don't either. What does it mean when black families' income is 3 times less than white families in this state? What does it mean to center those needs? I'm not sure exactly what it would mean. That's part of the wrestling I invite you to do as a community, but I will tell you that there are some implications. I want to share some of these implications and share a little information and then enter into conversation. Is that okay?
Yep.
I want to suggest and raise the question of concerns, and frankly, I've raised some of the concerns of our fears. Because I think we have to wrestle with our fears to get a sense of the promise of what can happen when we center children. In the context of this text, if we take it all together, this leader that we see in verses 1 through 5 may indeed be the leader that we see later in verses 6 through 9. First and foremost, I want to offer that if we take this seriously, the first thing we are doing as self-identified church folk is we reorient our messianic expectations. We reorient our messianic expectation. There was this thing that happened. I want to go back to this conversation about what was happening in the midst of the Ferguson uprising, the movement for Black Lives. There was a thing that happened to me. I went to a gathering in Asheville, North Carolina, with movement leaders from across the country convened by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in an initiative for racial equity and justice, where they were seeking to help leaders. Frankly, what they were doing with us in Ferguson is they were trying to give us an opportunity to get off the ground. They were having all kind of workshops and stuff like this, but they were doing healing circles, and they wanted us to get some rest, and they wanted us to get some massages, and they wanted us to engage in self-care. So they invited us to a convening in Asheville, North Carolina, and I like to know who's at the meetings. You know, I'm a little careful about, like, you know, I like to know who's on the docket, who's going to speak. That's fine, but I want to know who else is at the meeting. And I found out that our dear sister and one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter kind of network, global network, Patrice Cullors, was coming to the meeting. And so I decided I was going to rent a car because I was coming to the meeting before Patrice was coming to the meeting. And so I wanted to leave my session and go pick up Patrice from the airport because I figured by the time we got there, everybody's going to be all over Patrice. And so, because they know her and you know, and you know, all the things, right? And so I wanted to go pick her up. And so I went to pick her up from the airport. And as we were driving back to the convening from the airport, and it was so embarrassing because you know, I was supposed to be in this small group session, and then people moved around. And while I was gone, my group moved to the lobby. And so I walked back in with Patrice, and there was the group I was supposed to be in. That I left, and they were wondering where I was, and I was with my friend. But we were in this conversation, coming back from the airport. And we're talking about the challenge of leadership in the midst of the movement. And the way people had conflated their ideas of what leaders look like with who should be leading in the moment in the uprising in Ferguson in the early days of the movement for Black Lives. And I said, you know, part of the problem, Patrice, is they're looking for, now you gotta be kind, people. Y'all say y'all church folk, be kind, okay? Be kind. This was 8 and 9 years ago. I was 8, 9 years younger. I said they are looking for a young-ish, young black preacher with a dark suit, white shirt, and a tie with closely coiffed hair and no facial hair. They're looking for a king-ish figure. And because they're looking for someone that looks more like me, they're missing you. Black queer woman who doesn't care about what you think about what she got on, lives the life of an artist, communicates and creates and curates in that way, in ways that people who are thinking linearly through history don't understand. And not only, frankly, are people looking for that kind of figure, so they look at me and miss you, but they also look at some of themselves and they think they're the ones called just because they look like. The parochial nature of our history and storytelling is such that we look for something in American history, so we look 2 generations back into the civil rights movement rather than looking globally and find that there are taproots of anti-blackness that we can learn from in our own lifetimes in South Africa in this moment for the movement for Black lives. We are so very limited. Our expectations of who's been anointed are clouding our capacity to do good work. I saw a good meme, a reminder through LinkedIn a few months ago. It was also a reminder and a concern, maybe I shouldn't say this, but a concern about young brothers with dark suits with no ties. This is a different one. Every black man with a dark suit, white shirt, and no tie is not a racial equity expert.
Hello.
Because we have expectations of what leadership looks like for different moments, we miss those who have been smeared. Anointing. Smearing. There are those, and we need to reset and reorient our expectations. This text, in many contexts, we've come to read it in our Christian times, post-Isaiah, post-Christ, as a read back of the promise of Jesus, one who would come in the line of Jesse and the line of David, a promised king who would come and sit upon the throne. That must be Jesus. I don't come just to disabuse you of the notion of your reading of the text as Jesus. I just want you to read it first in the context of Isaiah. And in that context, I have to level set and say that it is not just about a promised anointed one who's been smeared. Y'all know that's what anointing is, right? It's not in the manuscript, but there's something about the true leader getting smeared that this chapel brings up for me. I don't know what that is, y'all. A promised anointed one who is yet to come. It's about the reality in the context where God can provide leadership in our moments. It resets our expectations about who the Messiahs are. And there can be anointed ones who sit and stand among us whom we come to know in our time, and is appropriate for us as a context and community to affirm the anointing in those who are sent in our time. In the sanctuary. These sanctuaries we gather in church, pre-COVID, we anointed them ushers. In Black church, well, we had whole ceremonies for ushers. They got dances and moves and steps and gloves and everything else. Boy, but in COVID, them 16-year-olds who knew how to work that audio-visual board, glory to God. Our expectations of who's anointed should change based upon the needs of the moment. And when we understand that public policy has been used to divide us, then we shouldn't look to the same kinds of leaders in public policy to heal us. When we understand that certain leaders out of certain planning and design schools are the ones who used and lifted the terminologies of redlining and urban blight and benign neglect to rip whole communities apart or drive highways through them, then we should not be looking for people with the same pedigrees and from the same schools to transform our communities from the segregation that we find ourselves in. We need new ways of knowing and to affirm new manifestations of being. We need to reset our messianic expectations. Then, if we take this seriously, that leadership may come from new places, that it may come from new, fresh winds and young people, then we root and we replant the promise of progeny. First, we must reorient our messianic expectations. Second, we root and replant the promise of progeny. We get caught up, especially those of us who have been around the church long enough to engage and have passed through a moment in ministry where everything and everybody talked about for about 7 years. I counted them for 7 years. 7 years, and I was in the South, so maybe I didn't do this in Pittsburgh. For 7 years, everybody talked about increasing territory. Everything in ministry everywhere was about, Lord, increase my territory. And what it did was, through that popular phrase and the engagement of particular text, the prayer of Jabez that is in the text, we shouldn't take it out of the text, we should keep it contextualized in the context of the text, but we threw away other parts of the Old Testament promise of what it meant to be God's people. Other parts of the promise. Yes, there's a promise of the land, increase my territory. There's a promise of God's presence, I'll be with you. And there's a promise of progeny. I will make your name great. Of you there will be many nations. The promise of children who are the gift in your quiver, the psalmist says. We reaffirm one of the foundational theologies that has been part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the promise of progeny. Then we reset expectations in a new way. The expectation that God is with us because children are with us. We must come to an understanding and appreciation that children are indeed a gift from God, that, quote, blessed is the one whose quiver is full of them, as the psalmist suggests, and we affirm that we reorient our ministry. I wish I had a really good example here. I talked about, I had this opportunity. I want you to take this to community. I'm almost done. If we could take seriously in neighborhood, community, and city what happens in the life of our churches. I had this chance to mentor a pastor in St. Louis. Can I be vulnerable with you all? Can I be honest with you all? I grew up in the Black church tradition. I've served in the United Methodist Church. I served in the UCC Church. You know what I didn't know until I came to the UCC Church? I didn't know that church is closed. I didn't know it. I didn't, like, Black church don't close. As long as you got, like, you know, your cousins in them, you, like, you know what I'm saying? You can still be called pastor. You know, like, you don't need much. You just need a spot. And so there's this thing about church closures. And I had this opportunity to mentor someone who, in ministry, I was her elder, but in life, I was not. And so there was a woman who felt a sense of call to close a church. And so she was closing the church, and the last gathering of the church was to be the Sunday after an Easter Sunday. And on Easter Sunday, they did what a lot of us do that hour before worship on Easter Sunday, right? You have baptisms of children. And on Easter Sunday, for the baptism of the child, the church filled up. All these family members who hadn't been to church in a long time, they showed up, and they baptized. It was a beautiful moment, held up the baby, did the thing, and then went away. And then they had the service, and then next Sunday, they handed the church over to another congregation in the life of succession and the like, and they closed the church. And I had the chance to sit with this dear sister who went through that experience, and there was a sense where she was agitated by these people who showed up on Easter morning for the baptism, but don't show up regularly in worship. And I could feel her because I love her. And I wondered, I couldn't say it to her in a moment, right? Because I do have some pastoral sensibility. Well, what would happen if you shifted everything in the church to be around the hopes of that child? If the people won't show up for whatever's going on in the church, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on in the church, ain't Jesus, but they'll show up for the child. What if we took seriously centering the child that, by the way, doesn't get a vote until they come through confirmation, the child that we have exit after our children's sermon in the middle of worship, if not toward the front side, the child who not only doesn't have voice in public policy, but does not have voice in our polity. Could it be the case that if the church reoriented all its ministries to center the child every day in the way that you centered the child on Easter morning, wouldn't those same people come out for the ministries around the child? And if they came out for the ministries around the child, wouldn't your church be vibrant because they be coming out the child who had not yet been through confirmation class and could not get a vote in the congregational meeting, the child who didn't get a vote in the last pastoral search, the child who has no lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and has no one paying for his interest to be on the front line in the Build Back Better conversation or to ensure that they keep the expanded child tax credit that cut child poverty in half in a year, the child who 50 years after Richard Nixon wiped away through veto the opportunity to have comprehensive access to child care for every American, a child who is 3 and 4, So now we're waiting for it to happen through languishing efforts in the U.S. Senate. The child who's been effectively marginalized in American society in the context of the Senate and everything in our public debate in the context of our congregations. If you gave people the child, 2023, if you centered the black and brown children who are the child and put them at the center of your polity and your polity conversations, would you not yet live? Congregation, country, community. What does the community design look like for equitable futures for the majority of children who are black and brown? Is the school, again, the center of communal reflection? Is it the center of communal activity? Or is it still the high steeple seminary? Church, doesn't matter. Is it City Hall? Or is it the school? Because they do not sit equally anymore in the middle of the town square. I'm glad everybody here knows what a town square is. We just cut the room by generations. You remember the town square? I remember in East Texas where I used to go for family reunions. There literally was they called it a town square, but it was a circle. Middle of the circle in the middle of town, there was the City Hall, still is in Gilman, Texas. There was a church, the meeting house, and there was a school, who sat in conversation with one another. The school, what is in the middle of the town center. If we want to get over these three segregations, I think we've got to reorient our messianic expectations. I think we've got to root and replant the promise of progeny. And finally, I think this will help us to resurrect the hope of a reordered creation. I said I was going to come back to something. I want to put this thing back together. I want to challenge the biblical scholarship that separates verses 1 through 5 from verses 6 through 9. I want to do it. I'm going to come on in here for a second. I want to do it not based on my credentials that you heard before, that I got a doctorate. And people who did this separation, they had PhDs. I want to do it not based on the fact that I've been to school. No, I don't want to do it like that. I want to do it based on the fact that I grew up as a young, black, marginalized child in America. I want to do it based upon the authority that I grew up in a historically black church tradition that also marginalizes different types of peoples and different types of bodies who love differently. I want to stand in the authority of saying everybody we read in this text separates the description of the ruler in verses 1 through 5 from the picture of one who is called a leader, who is a child, in the second part of the passage from 6 through 9, because they've all been adults. Adults with their own access to privilege, power, publishing, and pulpits. Adults who had their chance to make it to the pulpit and interpret this text for everyone else. Adults who look at the cosmic, comic, cartoon-like picture of a bear hanging out with what could be his steak dinner, a cow, and says that can't be real. Adults who, when they look at the mirror of leadership, see nothing but themselves. Adults who've said, I've got expertise and credentials to interpret this text by going to school where only adults can go. Adults. And since adults interpreted the text, then adults got to say this can't be the leader because these are children. Because we don't make the text in God's image, we make it in our own. Mostly the adult, white, old, privileged, rich men who get to access interpretation of text like this. The same ones in the context of the marks of white supremacist society, the marks of white dominant culture, which is fidelity to the written word over the oral tradition. the same ones who didn't see leadership roles for women, and the same ones who didn't see the affirmation of black and brown people, the same ones who can't see their way to the expansion of the Christian community to include those who are not heteronormative, the same people who are the same ones who keep children from being called leaders. There's no reason to separate verses 1 through 5 from verses 6 through 9. We describe a leader in verses 1 through 5, then we point to one in verses 6 through 9. It is continuous, it is linear. It just happens to be a child, and that child is doing things that we've never seen before and cannot imagine. When the children lead, the picture of the future becomes something that we could not have seen for ourselves because they see stuff that we don't see. Our recent elder turned ancestor, Bell Hooks, said it this way: most children are amazing critical thinkers until we train it out of them. When children lead, we get to resurrect a new view of hope, of creation that is different from the one that we've ever seen before, including one that can be the manifestation of beloved community. I was blessed. I'm almost done. I'm a black preacher. That was my second close. I get 3. I was blessed just about a year and a half ago in my reading to come across the work of Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Dr. Brown Douglas, one of those remarkable, valuable, and valued credentialed biblical scholars of our tradition, one of the greatest church women of our time, having written on the experience of being black and Christian in America and making sense of this God who allows us to live in a world where black lives don't seem to matter. And what she writes about in her most recent book that got one of the highest book awards in our tradition here recently, earlier this year, called Resurrection Hope, is the conversation she has had over the course of the last year and a half with her son. Her 27-year-old son who questioned her theological credentials and her commitment to her faith in Jesus Christ. Her 27-year-old hair locked up, 6-foot-plus black son who decided that in this nation where people continue to be cut down for just being black, there must be something wrong with this tradition where we keep giving glory to a God who allows this thing to happen. This son with critical questions informed by the education that we in the black church told him to go get in order to get ahead. This son who had to wrestle with the realities of faith just before us, and her son is just like y'all's sons and daughters. So don't be looking at me crazy, don't be looking at her crazy either. This son who sees what's going on and believes in an omnipotent, all-powerful God, and recognizing that what's going on and this God don't seem to make sense in the same conversation. And so this theological giant of a woman, this constructive theologian, this woman of the church, decided that it would only be faithful for her to wrestle with her own faith in light of the conversation and the questions that were coming from her son. So she spent pages over the course of a faith journey seeking out and make sense of her faith in light of the questions raised by her child. Y'all missed that, so this should be the last close. She understood the need to resurrect hope of faith in Jesus Christ by wrestling first with the questions that came to her from her son in order to construct the picture of a future where Black Lives Matter and where God is still on the throne. What am I suggesting here? I'm suggesting that we've got to allow young people to lead in conversations. We've got to allow some young people to invite us into spaces. We've got to allow younger people to guide us into questions that we would not have asked. Even the best of us cannot guide the rest of us in a witness to faithfully get to a picture of God's desired future if we do not listen first and take seriously the voices of children. If nothing else, let us be clear. They are the ones you should be looking for when you're looking at the brothers with the dark suits and the white shirts who are supposed to be the racial equity experts. They are the ones whose experiences we must take seriously. They are the ones who have been transformed, and they are the ones who can transform us. What am I saying here? Real, last close, physical close. You know the most prominent story that we can all remember about a child being a neighbor? It had this phrase in it. Hey, Mr. Wilson! Hey, Mr. Wilson! Who was that child? The menace. To whom are we neighbor? The child who has been marginalized, and the one we remember most as neighbor in our popular culture was called the menace. And I want to argue that until we construct around Derek, I had to get to a true picture of America's children. America's children ain't Dennis. They're Derek. They're DeAndre. They're Delethea. They're Deja. Deja, who is a menace to public policy, which continues to separate us. Delethea, who is a menace to an America that is divided, who has made Fox News the #1 news channel in America, that seeks not to tell her history or care for her social emotional wellness. She is a menace, but she is the neighbor you must center in your conversations to build a beloved community. Hers is the voice. I spoke all of this time just to point to her. Now that I've done it, I'm done. Let's talk.
A reminder that we have a microphone here for our in-person attendees. Please come on up. If you are unable to make it up to the microphone, just raise your hand and I'll come find you. We do have a number of questions coming in from online. I will go ahead and give some to you. How do we steward our children and give them authority? How do we give them voice and yet share the authority as our mandate? Because our mandate of authority begs us to share it but not give it over.
Yeah, we've decided that we have this mandate of authority. We've given ourselves authority. There's a great book that I encourage you to read. I'm wrestling with it right now, called A Minor Revolution. Part of what it does is it walks through the history of the last 100 years of the children's rights movement. A century ago, there was a movement of what we call child savers in America. It led to the establishment of organizations like the one I saw, and I think it was South Acre Street when I drove in, the Children's Home Society here in Pittsburgh, where we established institutions to care for children, and we began to, in America, make the first 2 moves of children's rights. The global children's rights movement is built on 3 legs: protection of children, provision of children, and participation of children. Participation was the move that we sought to make with the development of the UN Children's Bill of Rights, that of 193 countries, the US is the only one that didn't sign them. In the discussions around it, what became part of the negotiation is the same discussion that you saw manifest in school districts across the country over the course of the last 2 years. It is the tension between children's rights and parents' rights. And what happened is something that I believe is a theological problem, because it's a manifestation that comes out of the church, and I can trace it back in evangelical theology, which is a move that children have gone from being the promise of progeny for a community to the private property of parents. And so we have given ourselves individual authority over our individual children, and it has 2 different implications. Number one, if your children are your property, then it's your responsibility to educate them, not mine. You know what that means? I don't have to invest in public education. You know what that means? You can't tell me what to teach my children, what my children should learn, even though you're the ones with the degrees, you're the ones who got the education, you're the ones who know about formation, you're the ones who know about pedagogy because you were educated for this purpose, and you're the ones who are the stewards of public resources because you're elected to the school board. You can't tell me what to do with my children. So it does two things. Number one, it allows people to hold their children back, even though what happens with those children have implications for yours and your own. It also helps us to make an argument for divesting from public resources that were down to the benefit of all children. Okay, public education, child welfare system, even juvenile legal systems that are restorative. All of these things, we don't have to invest in them because your children are your problem. In America, we were the ones who were wrestling at the UN to put parents' rights in a place where the global context was arguing for the inclusion of young people's voices. And it has very specific implications. Can I tell you one? I got to tell our business if I can tell you. Can I tell y'all I love our business? In the child advocacy space that the Children's Defense Fund has deeply worked in for 50 years, and in many ways, by the credit of my founder, Marian Wright Edelman, has crafted and created space for in America, has centered conversations that make the advocates quite comfortable. The advocates who generally don't reflect the demographics of the children. Right? Our child advocacy space is led largely by privileged white women with degrees from the best social work schools in the country. God love them all. These are my dear sisters in this work. And what they don't feel comfortable talking about is the first thing you ask children about. If you ask them about their well-being, the children say something that the advocates don't. What do they say? Dr. Asher Ben-Aria, I got to make sure I got my papers in order on this one, because people don't like it when I say it. Dr. Asher Ben-Aria from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem developed a taxonomy of child well-being based upon and rooted in asking children. And when you ask children, the first thing they talk about when you ask them are they well is violence in their home, in their neighborhood, or in their communities. One of the last things on the child advocacy agenda in America is urban violence and police violence, because it is not something that makes the community of advocates most comfortable. But it is exactly what the children need us to be talking about. And so we have to figure out how to align to listen to them and honor like participation, third leg of the stool. Participation and inclusion of children's voice will change the policy agenda. Okay? So this is, how do we do this? How we do, we decide to do everything we want to do. This is about building will. Some of this is about understanding and appreciating. I want to kind of go along the journey. The first move is to connect with the child that moves us and causes us to reorder our lives. Most child advocates have one. For me, it is Amber Ella Marie Wilson. She is 7 years old. She's my daughter. Now, I got boys, they're 13, 14, and 17. I'm not as moved by them right now. I'm just saying. I'll reorient my whole day for Amber Ella Marie Wilson, right? And so the first move is, who's the child that connects with you that will cause you to change? Mother Mary Frances Browning from Greater Mount Carmel says the powerful thing about God is that God will change your want-tos. Who is the child that will change your want-tos? Listen to that child. Pay attention to that child. See what the things are that are harming, challenging, or creating issue for that child. And then bridge to other children that are in that child's classroom. And try to conjure the will and keep up the courage to fight for that, for them, the way you do for her. I think that's part of it. We only give up authority. You married people in here? You don't start out giving up all your own want-tos. As love grows over time and commitment to someone grows, then you back away and give up some of your authority in the interest of their growth, development, and humanity. And that's what I'm asking adults to do for children.
So many questions online. I'd invite those of you here in person also to come to the microphone, please. This is actually a little related to your earlier comments in response to the previous question. One of our online participants talks about there are more than 100 bills right now that will prohibit gender-affirming care, and adding to that, we've got other bills, of course, for banning books and thinking that we are protecting children by preventing drag shows and whatnot, all of this with the rhetoric of protecting children. Our respondent would ask that you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we need the balance of all three legs of the stool of protection, provision, and participation, right? When you don't ask children, and when they don't get a voice, then you can say this is what's good for them, right? And this is part of the challenge. And we say very definitively in a couple of different ways. Number one, this is National Reading Month. So part of what we're celebrating on our social media platforms at CDF is banned books. So we're celebrating our favorite banned books, and they come from our integrated reading curriculum that choose, as an affront, frankly, a direct affront to states like Texas, where I grew up, that produces a disproportionate amount of textbooks for public schools across the country, frankly, where young people see themselves in their books, right? They're disproportionately Black and brown, they disproportionately see agency of young people, disproportionately see history and communities that look like them, because they don't see that in their school books. So we choose and curate a curriculum of books that we share with 17,000 young people every summer through our freedom schools, that we actually have to do this work to affirm and stand against. Some of it's just prophetic witness, right? The other is direct engagement. We actually have to be, I mentioned these school boards where parents show up and say, you can't do this for my children, for a reason, because I need some other people to show up to those school board meetings. Because whether you biologically birth them and whether you're raising them in your house or not, they are still your children. That's right. That's part of what I'm up to with this theological piece, right? They are not just arrows in your quiver. They are the promise for our entire community. They are the center of the image of peaceable kingdom. That's right. And so all of us have a stake. And so I say that to say we've got to engage directly in that conversation. Second, getting right to Texas. I never got so much backlash from an email than last year when I, along with Patrick Brissett, the head of our Texas office, sent out an email affirming that we needed to be providing health care to all children across spectrum, across the state of Texas and across the country, including gender-affirming health care. Right, and so this is a reality. We have to be in this conversation. It's really uncomfortable for us because of where we come from. But again, ask young people what they need and be thoughtful first about how it shows up, and be willing to walk alongside them on journey. This is a critical piece for us. If there was a third part where you're talking about banned books or education. No, it was the third part that I wanted to add, because I'm a Black preacher, we need three of everything. It's also Women's History Month, with Women's Heritage Month. And so as we talk about this, we actually have to lean into frameworks that will help us to understand things differently and work at intersections. And so I think it's critical for all of us, I literally say all of us, as we think about these intersections, how we get to this work best, is we have to take really seriously and assess critically and learn at the feet of Black feminism and womanism. The intersectional reality of the life experiences of these voices, including who are also the voices that disproportionately are raising children who live in poverty in America, are liberative for the experiences that we say we want in our communities. So I think these are three things we got to take seriously in order to take these issues seriously.
Which leads one of our people online to say, so you're saying that our children live according to survival ethics and their adult owners, quote unquote, live according to prosperity ethics.
I like that. I want to wrestle with it. I think there's a lot in that. I think if I had to add an element, if I understand it fully, I leave myself room to shift on this a little bit later as I reflected a little bit more. But it's not just that these two lanes are living parallel to one another. One, the children are living in survival because the adults are living in prosperity. Like, these are things we helped. Our founder work with at the Children's Defense Fund, helped to establish an organization a number of years ago called Generations United, Because on the Hill, part of what people tried to do was pit the grandparents against the grandkids. Are we going to get senior supports and services? Which, by the way, we disproportionately do because seniors disproportionately turn out to vote. And the grandparents said, we're not going to let you separate me from my grandbabies. And so we set up an organization that is generationally fighting for this. But the ethic of, the ethic of these systems chooses one over the other. And those of us who seek to build community must not allow that to be, right? And we can say that generationally. But let me be very clear, I don't want to miss this point, because I want to honor our theme. Part of what we do when we do it generationally is we're also doing it racially. The 75 million people, the 150 million people who voted were much whiter than the 74 million young people who didn't get a vote at all. Right? In one of the last fights I had in the state of Missouri, which is where I'm going back to next week, I fought the Capitol before I left. Next week I'm speaking at the Capitol. He gave me some talking points, like I'm gonna use them. Was that they were changing, they were not counting. This is happening across the country, that's why I mentioned it here in Pittsburgh. I don't know if it's happening in Pennsylvania. But in the processes they were preparing for redistricting, they were changing the laws so they didn't have to count children in the reallocation of the districts. Children who were disproportionately black and brown, much browner than the adults, much browner than the legislature, as a way to hold power for another generation. Wow. For another decade, let me be accurate. For another decade, right? And so, children live in survival ethic because adults get to live in prosperity ethic, and we're using public policy to hold the two together.
Nobody in here?
Uh-oh.
John. Oh, boy.
This is a simple question, so the tougher ones are online. Thank you again for illuminating the text and challenging what has been normative to us.
Thanks, Doc.
Preaching Isaiah. Simple question is this. So when we look at globally, and of course, the United States, there's a lot of UN resolutions we haven't ratified, because we're just privileged like that. But when you look globally, and in the areas of child advocacy and child development, who is doing it right that we could learn from?
Yeah. Oh, great. And there are pockets even in the U.S. I really appreciate that question. So globally, on theory, I quoted very intentionally Asher Ben Area from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I think a lot of the scholarship around getting to theories of child well-being is coming well out of Hebrew University. As we talk about youth work, youth philanthropy and support around young people. In Germany, there are systems there, philanthropies and systems built to really affirm young people across the developmental course. And frankly, I like to tell people in the U.S., especially people in the Northeast when I go places, there are models in places like the really progressive state of Oklahoma, where we have tested ideas like, in this case, opening up child development accounts and college savings accounts for young people randomized as they are born. So you open up an account for them when they're born, you put some money in it for them to go to college. And what we've proven over course is that just opening it up, giving a sense of hope that you will go to college and you can, has shifted parental engagements in young people's lives, has made sure that young people do better in school, and those young people are healthier and have access to more resources if you give a sense of hope in the beginning. And then I point to the U.S., right? We had the best test case. You've done enough policy advocacy, Dr. Welch, to know that one of the things that we get told all the time is go prove it works. And guess what we did? So most English-speaking industrialized nations have a child allowance, meaning we affirm that having children is a value to the nation. And so when you have them, you receive an allowance to support the raising of your children that you can use how you need to use it to support your family. The closest we ever came to having that in the U.S. is 2021 when the expanded child tax credit made it fully refundable for a year. And we proved the case right? CDF works with the Center for the Development of Social Policy, and we, bottom line, a coalition for an automatic benefit for children, so that our children here should get what all of these other English-speaking industrialized nations have. And we've proven that it reduces child poverty, it helps to reduce hunger, it makes children healthier. We have a national population level study for a year. And by the way, we had Democrats, I don't know what party nobody's a part of, that's why I'm looking off into the sky, leading in both houses of Congress and the White House, and we still let it go. This is not about partisanship. This is about public will to serve those whose voices have been marginalized. So it's not about proving it, it's about power and about building public will. And again, those children were disproportionately black and brown.
Any last words of hope you would like to leave us with?
Yeah, I can end on that question. The hope is here, right? Worst thing you can do is preach after the preacher or preach another text once you've preached one. But I want to center this other thing about children in the text among these church folk. Passage of scripture tells the story of Jesus going into the temple and making sacrifice with all the disciples. The sacrifice that Jesus makes with all the disciples is equivalent to the sacrifice that is called to be made for two poor adults. Difference between poor adults and other adults: sacrifice a dove, sacrifice a pigeon. Sacrifice of pigeons. It is clear that Peter, of the disciples, is of an adult age to make a sacrifice, but all the disciples went in with Jesus. Sacrifice is only made for two adults. Where is the hope? The hope is that we've also misread the picture of these disciples, these bearded disciples, that we have decided must have been old men like Jesus. Because when we read the text well and closely, we also learn that young people leave to walk with their teachers and rabbis when they're about 12, 13 years old. The hope is that that 13-year-old son, that 14-year-old son, that 17-year-old son, oh man, where I would choose rather my 7-year-old daughter over them, those were the ones who were actually walking with Jesus. Those are the ones that he chose and he privileged. Those are the ones that scripture says came to turn the world, to set the world on fire, and have turned it upside down. My hope is that the Jesus movement that became the church is actually a children's movement from the very beginning. And as we return to such, we'll be able to build the community that God desires for us and we even desire for ourselves. Blessings, family.
Join me in thanking him.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's engaged. We had over 30 people online, as well as a pretty packed house here. So we thank you for coming to the 2023 Kelso Lecture and Community Conversation on Race and Faith. We have a wonderful reception for you downstairs, but before you go, I'd like to thank the Program and Administrative Assistant for the Metro Urban Institute, Ms. Lisa Bunting, who is downstairs helping to get everything together. She has been working extremely hard to bring all of these pieces together. Also, our student worker, Elizabeth Nicodemus, who is also downstairs, and our GCUM students. That's the Graduate Certificate in Urban Ministry, which is a part of the Metro Urban Institute. So if you are interested in bridging faith and justice and getting a little bit more education along the way, we want to make sure that you are aware that we have a Graduate Certificate in Urban Ministry that's only 4 courses. courses. So you can complete it in 1 to 2 years, and we encourage you to ask us for more information. I also just want to note that many of you registered not only for tonight's lecture, but also for tomorrow's conference. You should have already received information via email about details with that, but just as a reminder, we will start off with continental breakfast at 8 o'clock a.m. in the Knox room that is right over there, and then we begin with the plenary session at 8:30, and then we move into 2 sections of workshops. We'll have a worship service, and Reverend Swanson will deliver our homily, and then we'll commune together in lunch, where we also have 6 different neighborhood organizations that are doing grassroots activism that will be there with us so that you can begin to commit to doing the work that we're talking about and making that come to life here in Pittsburgh. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to everyone who was online. We had people from various states online as well as various states here in the place. Join us now downstairs for a lovely reception. Thank you so much and good night.